Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Shank, and I'm the Deputy Director of Legal Aid Chicago. Welcome to Legal Aid Chicago's second session of our series, The Emerging Legal Crisis Facing Chicago's Black and Brown Communities. Today's session will focus on domestic violence. It's my pleasure to introduce our host today, Katie Janke-Dale. She's a partner at DLA Piper and is the co-chair of our Ambassadors Board Executive Committee. Katie?
Thank you, Kate. As Kate said, my name is Katie Janke-Dale. I'm a partner in the real estate group at DLA, but more importantly for today's purposes, I'm honored to be the co-chair of Legal Aid Chicago's Ambassadors Board. DLA Piper has a long and close history with Legal Aid Chicago, from our 10-year partnership on the Woodlawn Legal Clinic to most recently hosting virtual clinics for survivors of domestic violence. Personally, I can say that my very first pro bono case representing a survivor of domestic violence was with Legal Aid Chicago. And I had Kate Shank's phone number on speed dial every time I stepped foot in the Daly Center to represent that client. We are honored to be one of the sponsors, along with all the other firms shown on the screen, of this important CLE series. And I'm also honored to have the opportunity to introduce the three speakers for today's CLE. Today you'll be hearing from Amanda Pyron, the Executive Director of the Network Advocating Against Domestic Violence, Benna Crawford, the Director of the Children and Families Legal Practice at Legal Aid Chicago, and finally Liz Rodriguez, a staff attorney working with Benna on their important work at Legal Aid Chicago. With that, I'll turn it over to Amanda to start the substantive presentation, but thank you again for allowing me to be here.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and for all of your work on behalf of victims and survivors of domestic violence. I certainly concur with the usefulness of having Legal Aid Chicago's attorneys on speed dial. I do the same thing with Benna Crawford, who's going to be presenting later in this session. I think it is always wise to utilize the resources and the expertise of the Legal Aid Chicago staff. I'm delighted to be here today to talk about the network and our work in Chicago. To get started, I'll tell you a little bit about the network. If you look over to the next slide, you'll notice that the network is a collaborative membership organization of 30 organizations that provide domestic violence related services here in Chicago. The network's dedicated to improving the lives of those impacted by domestic violence through education, public policy and advocacy, and the connection of community members to direct service providers. We're proud to count Legal Aid Chicago as a member, and we, as I mentioned, value their partnership intensely. If you look over to the next slide, you'll notice that we work with a variety of different survivors. Today, we'll be talking about the challenges that face Black and Brown survivors when you combine racial inequity and racial injustice with survivorship and having to survive all of the hardships that domestic violence can bring as folks try to navigate safety and determine how to survive. The majority of survivors who contacted the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline identified as female, heterosexual, and Black. When statewide data from InfoNet was compared against data from the hotline, this overrepresentation of Black survivors decreased slightly. So we know that most survivors of color are concentrated in the Chicago metropolitan area. 55% of the domestic violence survivors that called the hotline, again, were Black. So an overrepresentation of survivors of color seeking services and experiencing crisis and looking for somewhere to turn, somewhere safe to go, and contacting the hotline. The majority of survivors are under the age of 45 and 11% are between the ages of 18 and 24. So when we talk about inequity, we're not just talking about race, even though that's the focus of today's session, but we also know that many of our survivors seeking services trend younger. And so we want to always be kind of looking at different survivor demographics to understand some of the challenges that survivors face and begin to develop services around those survivors, particularly broad-based services that don't rely on the criminal legal system, which may not always be a safe place for survivors of color. So as we move along to further look at demographics and survivor needs, what we noticed is that in 2019, less than 20% of domestic violence survivors reported having a long-term housing destination. And where that's a challenge is in securing safety long-term for survivors of domestic violence as they address legal needs. We, as I mentioned, value the Legal Aid Chicago partnership. And one of the ways that we've partnered with Legal Aid Chicago intensely recently is over the network's Crisis Response Fund. So in response to COVID-19, the network established a crisis response fund or an emergency fund to be able to make cash grants directly to victims and survivors in need who are experiencing economic hardship as a result of the coronavirus, but also often had extenuating circumstances beyond the coronavirus crisis. And Legal Aid Chicago has been a huge partner in this, in that they've referred quite a number of clients to this emergency response fund. And many of these clients, in fact, I would say probably over 80% of these clients are undocumented survivors. Survivors that have come to Legal Aid Chicago for assistance with URT visas or for assistance with orders of protection, or many other legal issues related to parenting or safe housing or securing safety. And the network has been able to grant some financial stability to these clients. And in fact, one survivor was a mother who wanted to remain safely in the United States, who needed immigration protection, but also was struggling with an order of protection application and had lost her house, currently homeless. And that's, kind of a typical example of a legal aid client and a network survivor who needs kind of a variety of needs met, and by virtue of immigration status and race, experiences much greater hardship than other applicants with a bit more privilege in those areas. As we looked at survivor needs in our recent 2019 data report, what we realized the most widely used services: legal advocacy, counseling, and case management. And I know that's no surprise to many of you who do amazing pro bono work in Chicago and Cook County to know that legal advocacy is one of the biggest needs of survivors of domestic violence in this area. You've struggled with the court system. You know what it can be like for folks who have education, who have privilege, who have the ability to be represented. So imagine what those challenges are like if you're a pro se litigant walking into a courthouse at 555 West Harrison. So it's the goal of the network to work with Legal Aid Chicago and our other legal partners to make sure that all victims and survivors who enter the court system have an advocate or an attorney working with them on their case. It's just simply too big of a system, too difficult of a system to navigate without representation. And we really, really strive to make sure that this is something that we can focus on over the next year and really increase services to survivors of domestic violence who need safety. The majority of survivors in our area do respond that they like the services that they're provided, and that once they receive services, they feel hopeful, they can safety plan, and they feel safer. So we know that what we're doing when we're able to do it works. We still have a limited capacity, as I just acknowledged. Many survivors coming into the courthouse are pro se litigants. We also had 4,033 adults and 4,018 children turned away from domestic violence services last year because we simply could not meet the demand. And so we want to work to increase funding for services and to increase access to these services for victims and survivors of domestic violence. Now to talk a little bit more about kind of the in-depth services that Legal Aid Chicago provides is Elizabeth Rodriguez, the staff attorney from the Children and Families Practice Group at Legal Aid Chicago. So Liz, take it away.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you so much for the work of the network. I do want to pivot to specifics in my caseload, and I just want to preface that by, today's topic is focused around COVID-19 domestic violence, specifically in Black and Brown communities. But as you've heard from Amanda, and as you'll continue to hear from today, pre-COVID-19, there has been a lack of available resources for domestic violence survivors seeking basic human needs, right? And so what we see is that a lot of times people are having issues accessing food, shelter, and safety. And so the lack of access to resources is amplified in Black and Brown communities and for Black and Brown survivors who have long experienced disinvestment in their communities, and who may have restrictions to accessing these things based on language barriers and or restrictions related to their immigration status. And so for today's purposes, I'll be focusing on survey results and case studies related to the Latinx community, because they're the most prevalent population in my caseload, and also because they're a community that I hold dear and close to my heart. So I want to start with just reviewing the rate of infection in the state of Illinois. So 41% of the Illinois total infection rate for COVID is Latinx. That's about half of the total population of people who test positive, even though they're only 17% of the state population. More so than that, there's an increased mortality rate for Black and Brown community members within Illinois, which is extremely daunting. This is also no surprise, considering the fact that these populations have been historically disregarded and undervalued. So we can see from this that the Latinx community is 2 times as likely to die when testing positive for COVID, and Black or African Americans are 3 times as likely to die when testing positive. And so while we consider what is important to us as a society going through a pandemic, I think it's imperative that we highlight the experiences and the experiences and the stories of the most vulnerable populations. And these are vulnerable populations prior to COVID, right? So who does that involve? It's Black and Brown people, it's undocumented people, it's children, and it's Latinx folks. So I do just want to review one of our cases to highlight the resiliency that is necessary to navigate resources for undocumented domestic violence survivors. So Tara came to the United States about 5 years ago. She came undocumented with 2 children. When coming to the United States, she married her husband, and they had a child together. It turned out that her husband was extremely abusive. Some examples of that, I could talk about that all day, but I think for me, the most is that, he would yell at her in public to the point of her crying, right? Like at grocery stores and laundromats. He restricted and limited her access to food and water to the point that she, her neighbors would have to assist her in accessing water and food while she was pregnant. And it was only after she gave birth and she realized that her abuser was then physically abusing their minor child that she, that was the final straw for her. She called the police, DCFS became involved, and she followed the recommendation to go to a domestic violence shelter. And so she left to a domestic violence shelter with, a lot of barriers in her access to resources. She was undocumented, which meant that she's ineligible for a lot of public resources that are required to meet people's basic needs, right? Food, housing, medical insurance. And she had no support system because her abuser isolated her. And more than that, she was monolingual Spanish speaking with no United States education, which really impacted the availability or accessibility rather of any resources that would be available to her. And so she went to a domestic violence shelter with no money, 3 kids, and absolutely no support system. She then filed an order of protection proceeding against her abuser to ensure the safety of herself and her children. Legal Aid Chicago is representing her for those order of protection proceedings. In addition to that, Tara was in the middle of deportation proceedings, or rather, ICE was requiring that she return to her home country, despite the fact, right, that she was a victim of abuse both in her home country and in the United States, which Legal Aid Chicago has stepped up and is assisting her in fighting her deportation, her removal proceedings, as well as assisting her in getting, completing a legal proceeding for VAWA to ensure that her and her children have legal status here. And more than that, her abuser filed for divorce. And so Legal Aid Chicago has stepped up and are representing her for that. And so not only was she trying to create a new life for herself and her family with no money or support, she was also participating in 3 different court proceedings in 2 different courthouses. And so when COVID hit, that just amplified the issues that were already existing. Her DV shelter had a coronavirus outbreak, and so she was forced to move to about 3 different locations in 2 months. And so with all of that happening, you know, it's just so impossible to think that one person can manage all of that to move forward and successfully transition from an abusive relationship with no resources to a stable, functioning home. And thankfully, with Legal Aid Chicago and their assistance with the client, with partner firms and service agencies, Tara is now in a more stable position than she was just a few months ago. So what does this mean in total, right? In summary, we have the ability to increase her understanding of access of the courts. We represent her in 4 different court proceedings: divorce, order of protection, ensuring that her and her children have a secure standing in the United States, as well as, you know, stability and living here permanently. We increased our access to resources by keeping clear communication between all service agencies. This is not something that could have been done by myself, by the client, by herself. It was a truly collaborative work between multiple attorneys, multiple partner agencies, multiple partner firms to ensure that this client received immediate access to all of the things that she could receive. So one of the most prevalent examples is, you know, we clearly communicated, the immigration team clearly communicated to us when she was eligible for public benefits based on her VAWA petition. And so when that happened, right, as we're all stretched extremely thin, we had the communication to say, she is eligible today. Who can do this and make this a priority today? And thankfully, there's always been someone available to step up and assist the survivor. And so next we look to increasing her financial stability and employment opportunities by, when she's eligible, assisting her in skill building, employment, searching, and daycare assistance. And, you know, this is just one example of what is being experienced by a Latinx survivor during COVID, right? And I just want to highlight, you know, Black and Brown survivors, Latinx survivors, undocumented survivors are currently going through layers of trauma, right? The trauma of living Black and Brown in the United States, the trauma of being potentially undocumented, invisible, and, you know, seeing that there are resources available to others, but they're intentionally disregarded and inaccessible to them. And also just living through the trauma of a pandemic. And on top of that, right, like as if that was not enough, also the trauma of having experienced abuse, potentially in their home country and in the United States now. And so for all those reasons, I mean, I'm just so proud in the collaborative work that was done in this specific case, but also I think it's reflective of a lot of the work that we do with our partner agencies and firms, and all while acknowledging that, you know, there's a lot of more work to be done. And so I'm optimistic that you guys are all here today and listening and receptive, and I look forward to doing a lot of work for this population moving forward. I'm now delighted to pass the stage over to Benna Crawford, the Director of Children and Families Practice Group of Legal Aid Chicago.
Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Liz and Amanda and Kate and Katie for getting us started. The COVID-19 pandemic has truly created the perfect storm for incidents of domestic violence to rise dramatically across all demographics. The stressors that can be triggers of domestic violence under pre-pandemic circumstances have increased for all of us. And those include the widespread economic instability and just general increased stress of living in a world that is scary and uncertain. The shelter-in-place orders and the restrictions on travel have also created a situation in which survivors or victims of abuse are trapped all day long in close quarters with their abusers. And their survivors are also experiencing increased isolation from the support networks that might have been available to them, informal or formal, before the pandemic. The very precautions that are necessary to protect against the spread of COVID-19 also have the effect of cutting survivors off from their family, their friends, and their support networks. Survivors who decide, despite all of this, that they want to try and leave and separate physically from their abuser have less options of where to go. It's not easy right now to just pick up and leave and go to a friend's house or go to a family member's house. And domestic violence shelter space, which, as you heard Amanda talk about, was grossly inadequate before COVID, has been further reduced as agencies have to put in place restrictions on capacity in order to keep the survivors that they're currently serving as well as their staff safe. There's also been a misconception that the courts are closed, making legal remedies unavailable, which has had the result in a lot of our cases of emboldening perpetrators of abuse. I can't tell you how many times we have heard from our clients who are survivors of abuse that their abuser said to them, there's nothing you can do, there's nowhere you can go, the judge can't help you now. And one of the most common ways that we have seen this manifest since the start of the pandemic is abusers taking advantage of what they see as being reduced access to the courts to ignore custody judgments and court orders and withhold children from their primary caretakers. From March 16th through July 6th, 2020, the Cook County courts entered a period, as many of you know, of significantly reduced operations. However, in recognition of the true emergency nature of these cases, throughout that entire time period, the courts remained open for survivors of abuse who were seeking protective orders. And so in many ways, the Domestic Violence Division and the attorneys and the court staff and the advocates who work in that division pioneered what remote court proceedings look like. And the domestic violence and the sexual assault advocacy communities fought really hard to create a fully remote option for survivors, whereby those survivors could apply for their protective orders, have their cases heard, and then receive copies of their protective orders without ever having to set foot in a courthouse. And this new world of remote proceedings has had a lot of benefits for survivors of abuse. Probably the most important way that it's done that is by creating options. Coming to the courthouse can be a real burden under normal circumstances. Many people in Cook County have to travel very long distances to get to their nearest courthouse. They have to find somebody to care for their children, and they may have to miss work. And for those with unstable employment, they may risk getting fired. What COVID-19 has done is it has amplified all of these risks. Now traveling on public transportation could be dangerous to your health. Finding childcare is even more difficult now than it was pre-COVID. And the economic stakes for many of us, but especially for low-income people, of losing a job are just even higher. Being able to file a case and appear in court via Zoom is a hugely beneficial option for survivors that decreases these burdens significantly. It's also worth noting that coming to court and putting yourself in the same physical space as your abuser can give him increased access to the survivor and create the potential for continued abuse and harassment. So these remote court proceedings in many ways opened the doors to the courthouse that might have been otherwise closed to survivors who could not overcome these challenges or chose not to deal with these challenges of appearing in person. And I know that I speak on behalf of many people who work in the domestic violence realm when I say that I'm hopeful that this option for remote proceedings will extend beyond the current pandemic and be incorporated into normal court proceedings going forward. It's not all roses, though, and I don't mean to imply that it is. Remote proceedings have not been without significant challenges. When they appear in person in a courthouse, survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault are met by advocates or attorneys who can help them with their cases. Immediately after the court shut down, Legal Aid Chicago realized that with all of these support networks that were in person in the courthouse now sheltering in place or working remotely, there was a significant gap in services available to survivors. So we joined with our pro bono partners and attorneys from firms across Chicago to create the Remote Order of Protection Assistance Hotline. And this hotline was amazing because it connected survivors at the courthouse to pro bono attorneys who could help them draft all of their paperwork, transmit it to the court, and talk to them about what they should expect as their next steps. And our agency was able to pioneer this remote assistance model and show not only that it was possible to serve survivors remotely, but that it was also extremely helpful. And in partnership with these our pro bono partners, we were able to fill this gap in service until the domestic violence agencies could get their own hotlines up and running. And once they did, we were able to wind this project down and refocus our energies on what we do best, which is representing survivors in court. And while domestic violence advocates and agencies across the county have done a really phenomenal job of supporting survivors remotely, it is just hard to replicate the ease of connecting with somebody when you're in the same building. In addition, court appearances via Zoom take a lot of time and can move much more slowly than they do in person. In one of our cases, we were representing a woman who had a hearing in the domestic violence division who was literally sitting in her car at a rest stop on the side of the highway with her 2 small children in the back seat for 4 hours while she waited for her case to be called. And this type of inconvenience or amount of time can be especially challenging for low-income people who may have limited access to the devices or the technology necessary to participate in court remotely, or who may have limited data plans or access to Wi-Fi. It can also be really challenging for a survivor who is unrepresented to figure out what is happening in my case. Is my court date in person? Is it via Zoom? How do I get in via Zoom? Maybe what is Zoom? Whereas before the pandemic, people knew what to do. We know to go to the courthouse and we know where our courthouses are. Now, in order to access your court date, a survivor has to be savvy enough to know where to find this information, but also how to use the technology necessary to appear in court. And this can be truly challenging, or especially challenging for more vulnerable populations. For example, people who don't speak English, or people with disabilities, or older individuals. Perhaps the greatest challenge, however, has been how difficult it can be to reinstate a critical protective order when, despite a survivor's best efforts, technology just fails. So a technology fail is exactly what happened to a client of ours named Brenda. In April, when her husband strangled her and threatened her life, Brenda escaped with her children and sought the protection of the court and received an emergency order of protection. When she appeared for her next court date via Zoom to ask for that order to be extended to 2 years long, she did everything right. She signed into Zoom, she checked herself in with the court manager, and then she waited. And she waited, and 3 hours went by. And so she asked, how much longer will it be? And what she was told is your case has been dismissed. Because what happened was that the court forgot that she was there and she was in a breakout room and called her case, and wrongly assuming that she hadn't shown up for court, dismissed her critical protective order. And after unsuccessfully trying to get her protective order reinstated herself, she contacted us, and we were able to argue successfully that that order be put back in place. But this just shows how challenging this process can be for survivors who are diligently litigating their cases without the benefit of an attorney. Survivors who go to court and seek protection against their abusers, as you've already heard, have overcome so much. They have gotten away from their abusers. They have navigated the process of filing a case. They have sat through hours of waiting in Zoom. And then they did the hardest part, which is convincing a judge that they need this protection. And for the most part, the court system has made this monumental shift from in-person to remote proceedings in a very short period of time. But unfortunately, the last critical step of this process was not happening, which is actually getting copies of these protective orders that survivors have worked so hard to obtain into the hands of the survivors, which left survivors across Cook County without any proof that they had obtained these protective orders. After identifying this as a really systemic issue, Legal Aid Chicago reached out to the clerk's office, whose responsibility it is to transmit these orders, in mid-July to try and resolve the issue. And when we were unable to reach a resolution, on July 30th, Legal Aid Chicago filed a complaint for mandamus against Dorothy Brown, who's the clerk of the circuit court. Mandamus, for those of you who may not remember, or for those of you who don't know, is a cause of action that you file when there is a public official who is failing to perform what is just a clear non-discretionary duty. And when it comes to protective orders, the clerk's office has a clear non-discretionary duty to provide copies of protective orders to litigants immediately, and to transmit them to the Cook County Sheriff for entry into the law enforcement database the same day that they are issued by a judge. And while this is a ministerial duty, it is also can be a matter of life or death for survivors and for law enforcement. The Centers for Disease Control says that 16% of homicide victims in the United States are killed by their current or their former partner. And when you limit that pool of homicide victims just to female victims, the number skyrockets all the way to 50%. The United States Department of Justice also, regularly takes a look at fatal or law enforcement fatalities. And in 2016, they found that 41% of law enforcement officers who were killed responding to calls for service were responding to domestic related calls. And when they dug deeper to try and figure out why that fatality rate is so high, what they found was poor information sharing with officers before they went out to respond to that call was one of the leading causes of this high fatality rate, which really speaks to how critical it is that these orders get to survivors and law enforcement immediately. But these orders protect more than just life and death. For survivors, they can also protect housing, which, Amanda and Liz both talked about how hard it is to find housing for survivors of abuse. When you get an order of protection, one of the remedies that a judge can give you is to give you exclusive possession of your house, which means you get to stay and your abuser has to leave, which gives a survivor a safe place to stay. They don't have to try and find shelter and disrupt their lives, which is very difficult under the best of times and is exceptionally hard right now during COVID. These orders also protect the ability of primary caretakers to keep their children with them and safe. The Illinois Department of Children and Family Services often requires, when there is domestic violence in a home that exposes children to that domestic violence, they often require a survivor to show, I have received an order of protection against my abuser, in order to avoid those children being removed from the home. They're also necessary to give to daycare providers or schools to make sure that, you know, if I have an order of protection that says my ex can't come near my children, that if he shows up at the school, they need a copy of that order if they're going to say, no, we're not going to release your children to you. So what good is an order of protection without the order is the question. You know, unless both survivors and law enforcement have a copy of that protective order, the order is without any value at all. And after we filed our complaint for mandamus, I received calls and emails from many attorneys, many survivors, many domestic violence advocates who had never received a copy of the order that was issued in their protective order case. And one of these survivors realized just herself through her own unfortunate experiences just how little value these orders have if she didn't have a copy of them. When the order of protection that the survivor had against her ex-husband expired in early 2020, he laid in wait outside of her children's school and then stalked her and her children home from school and discovered where she was living. And for the next few months, on a daily basis, he showed up outside of her house and screamed obscenities and threats at both her and her children. And so one of these times she called the police after he threatened to kill her. And the police said to her, you need to go to court and you need to get an order of protection and then we can help you. So she did exactly that and she got her emergency order of protection. But despite 3 court appearances over Zoom over the course of June and July of this year, she never got a copy of her order. And when she called the police again after an especially terrifying incident, she had no copy of the order to show them. And when the police searched their own database, they also turned up no record of the order. So with nothing to prove that she had this order that the police had instructed her to get, the police once again told her there is nothing that we can do. So despite all of the steps that this woman had taken to protect herself and her children, the order that she had gotten was useless because she had no way to prove that it existed. On August 10th, 2020, Legal Aid Chicago obtained a temporary restraining order against the clerk of the court, which required that office to email copies of the all protective orders to litigants and to transmit them to the Cook County Sheriff for entry into the law enforcement database on the same day that they are issued. And in issuing his ruling, the judge acknowledged that the law means what it says. When it says immediately, that does not mean as soon as possible or as soon as is practicable. And he also acknowledged the tremendous value and necessity of these orders to protect against irreparable harm, as well as the fact that, you know, if somebody is harmed, if somebody is killed or their children are taken away from them or they're injured, that they can never be made whole again. And this was a tremendous victory, and it was especially exciting because it was not just a victory for Legal Aid Chicago's clients or the people that we are working with, but it was a victory for survivors across all of Cook County, because the temporary restraining order mandated not just that the clerk of the circuit court get Legal Aid Chicago their orders the same day, but rather, given that this was a matter that affected the public across all of Cook County, the order mandated transmission of these orders and compliance with the statute for survivors across all of Cook County. So now for survivors who choose to seek orders of protection as part of their plan for safety, they can now fully realize those potentially life-saving protections their orders were meant to provide. The COVID-19 pandemic has been truly devastating for people of color across Cook County. The increased risk of danger to people experiencing domestic violence is truly profound. And, you know, as Liz said, I am so proud of the work that agencies like the network and Legal Aid Chicago have done during this time to make safety and security a reality for survivors of abuse. And I also remain optimistic that we will be able to take the successes and the lessons that we have learned during this pandemic and this time of remote advocacy and remote court proceedings to reimagine a court system that is more accessible and friendly to survivors of abuse beyond the time of the pandemic. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Melissa Pachola, the Director of Legal Aid Chicago's Volunteer Services Unit.
Wonderful. Well, what an amazing impact you and the rest of the Children and Families group are making, Benna, both in terms of your individual cases and the systemic work that you just described. I am feeling inspired by your commitment and wanting to help, and I hope that many of you on the other side of my screen are feeling the same. As the Director of Volunteer Services at Legal Aid Chicago, I'm hoping to bring you an opportunity to work alongside us to help make a difference, both for individual clients and to help change the system as a whole. At Legal Aid Chicago, we have over 20 different pro bono opportunities, and we simply could not meet the needs of our clients without the help of volunteers who work alongside us to serve our clients and to help bring about justice for all. And you can see on this slide the high-level overview of our pro bono program and the impact that volunteers make. We have a variety of opportunities available, spanning the subject matters that we cover and offering everything from a short-term commitment of a couple of hours to a longer-term engagement. And we have also adapted many of our opportunities to allow for fully remote work during the pandemic. As you heard from Amanda, Liz, and Benna, the systems for domestic violence survivors are complicated, and resources are currently scarce due to the pandemic. So many people need help, and you can help by representing someone to get an order of protection. All hearings are being held remotely, and Legal Aid Chicago will co-counsel these cases with you. This is an opportunity to use your skills to help make a huge difference in the life of a client. This is also a short-term commitment, as your representation will only extend through the hearing on the order of protection. If the client has other outstanding legal issues, Legal Aid Chicago will be able to coordinate service on those issues. So you can find more information about all of our volunteer opportunities on our website, and you are welcome to reach out to me with any questions that you have about any of our opportunities and how you might be able to help. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kate Schenk.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And thanks also to Amanda, Liz, and Benna for those terrific presentations. So in just a minute, we're going to start the question and answer portion. But before we do, I'd like to give a plug for our upcoming Relay for Justice, which will run from August 31st to September 14th. It's free to join. Join us as we collectively log our miles by walking, running, biking, or swimming to travel together across the country with stops that mark vital moments in civil rights and civil justice history. You can learn more about the relay and sign up for it on our website. So I'd like to turn it over back to the panelists who will answer the questions, which you should type into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I think we already have some questions that have come in. So Benna, could you please lead us through the Q&A?
I'm happy to. Thank you, Kate. So I'm just going to go through. We've gotten some really great questions. Thank you. And as Kate mentioned, feel free if you have additional questions for any of the panelists to type them in. The first question is, was an official order issued by the courts in response to the mandamus filed against Dorothy Brown? And the answer to that is yes. While the case is still in its preliminary stages, on August 10th, a judge sitting in the Chancery Division issued a temporary restraining order compelling the clerk's office to comply with their statutory duties to transmit the orders via email to the litigants or their attorneys and to the sheriff the same day that they are entered. So yes, there was an official order. Thank you for that question. The next question is, one that I'm going to address, but probably not be able to fully answer, which is why the clerk couldn't issue the orders immediately. Did they lack resources, or were they ignoring their responsibilities, or something else? So I don't want to speak for the clerk of the circuit court, but what I will say is, for those of us who have had to transition our practices, our lives, our advocacy, and our jobs from an in-person to a remote world, that has been not a small task. It's been a very heavy lift for all of us. And sometimes motivation is needed to move things up the list of priorities. There was another question about the case against Dorothy Brown, which is asking, how is it being monitored for compliance? Is that Legal Aid Chicago and or other domestic violence agencies or law enforcement? And I think that the answer to that is also, that is ongoing and ever changing. In many ways, we are able to monitor compliance based on just our own experiences as attorneys who represent survivors in these cases, as domestic violence advocates or sexual assault advocates who have regular contact with survivors who are involved in court cases. We are able to monitor, are we receiving our orders? Are the survivors that we're interacting with receiving their orders in the way that's required by law? We had another great question, which is, can't police protect a person from threatened violence without a court protective order? And I think that the answer to that is complicated. And so I want to quickly answer part of it, and then perhaps Amanda can speak to some of the data that the network has collected on the experiences that the way that race comes into play when we're talking about a law enforcement response to domestic violence. You know, when the police show up after receiving a call, in order to arrest someone, they have to have probable cause that a crime was committed. And that's not often the case with, with an order of protection. And so one of the most valuable ways that an order of protection can keep a survivor safe is if I have an order of protection that just says, my ex-husband is not permitted to come to my house. If I have an order of protection and he shows up at my house, that's a violation that I can call the police and they look in their database and see this is an order of protection. It's a stay away order. He's violating the order, and that is enough probable cause for someone to be arrested just for showing up at a location they're not supposed to be. Absent an order of protection, if I call the police and say, my ex-husband is here, he's outside my door, and I'm afraid, if the police show up and that's all he's doing is standing there, that's not enough to create probable cause that a crime has been committed. But Amanda, I don't know if you can speak a little bit to the experiences of people of color with law enforcement response.
I think we can speak a little to that. I think the challenge with data and domestic violence is twofold. One, we don't track victims over time and kind of seeking services across our systems. And we also don't know who we're not serving, right? And so we think rather confidently that most or many survivors of color aren't accessing resources through the law enforcement system. We would hear that anecdotally through survivors who access resources outside of the law enforcement system by calling the hotline, for instance. As we know, 80% of the people who call the hotline, I think it's actually 81%, are survivors of color. So we know that they're reaching out to the hotline, which is a confidential resource not connected to law enforcement to obtain services. We also hear from our service providers who work predominantly with immigrant communities that those communities absolutely do not want any interaction with law enforcement because they're worried about being deported. And this is, kind of an ongoing fear and concern, but certainly something that has increased over the past few years with the federal administration's sort of importance on deporting people, so to speak. And so we know that those communities are calling our service providers overnight at their hotlines, calling the domestic violence hotline, asking for an advocate to come out and work with the offender, but not wanting the police to come out and do that. So they want advocates to come out and de-escalate situations because they're afraid of law enforcement. And these are all qualitative experiences that we hear through member organizations and through survivors who call the hotline. We also know recently there was a high-profile homicide in Chicago where a victim of domestic violence called her mother instead of calling the police. She was being physically abused. She contacted her mother and said, "Would you come and get me?" The mother showed up with the survivor's sister and was murdered by the offender, as was the sister, and the survivor was shot, but survived. And there you kind of wonder, we'll probably never know why that person didn't call the police. What we do know is that she was a person of color, she was a Black woman, and lived in an area of high deprivation and high gang activity. And so you wonder if that plays a factor in a survivor's decision to call the police, where, if they do call the police and they remain in that neighborhood, there might be social consequences to having involved law enforcement and invited law enforcement into that community. And so we know those are some of the concerns that are expressed by survivors. We do know that the Chicago Police Department is not a mandated arrest police department, unlike some police departments across the country. Chicago does not have to arrest anyone at the scene of a domestic violence incident. So they can go out to a scene, they can de-escalate situations, and they can leave without making a report or an arrest. And of course, there are positives to that and there are negatives to that. And what we've tried to do over the years is really educate law enforcement officers about providing the hotline number and providing follow-up resources to survivors of domestic violence, so that after an officer leaves, if there's no arrest made, the survivor can still reach out for resources, or if there is an arrest made, the survivor can use that time to safety plan with someone from the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline or a service provider to increase their ability to move to safety before that offender returns. So hopefully that answers everyone's questions. It's always tough with domestic violence to get a kind of concise, consistent answer across the board, because every survivor has their own unique strengths and unique experiences to bring to a situation.
Thank you, Amanda. And Melissa, did you want to add to that?
No, I did not. Thanks, Benna.
So we also had another question, which is a little similar, but whether you have to have a physical copy of the order of protection in order for officers to do something. The answer to that is no, you don't have to have a physical copy. What the Illinois Domestic Violence Act allows for police officers is they can arrest for violation of an order of protection if either they are able to find it in their law enforcement database, or if they are provided a copy of the order by the survivor, or I suppose the respondent in the order could provide it. So it is not necessary to have a physical copy, but it's a safeguard against, against if it doesn't show up in the law enforcement database or the police officers aren't able to find it. The other thing that I would say is that, this is a court order that you received, which says who has possession of the children, who is protected, what can and cannot be done to you, where you can be and where someone else can't. And so I think it should go without saying that survivors should be entitled to possess a copy of that order, whether it be via email or otherwise. So there's a question about whether there's any word on the outlying courthouses. So for example, the suburban district courts hearing orders of protection again. And the good news is that yes, the suburban district, you can now, all of the courthouses in Cook County, so Daly Center, the domestic violence courthouse, and then the suburban district courts are all hearing orders of protection cases. The only exception to that is that survivors who live close to the Maywood courthouse who are seeking an emergency order, so they're filing their initial case, the Maywood courthouse is still closed to new case filings, and those need to be filed at downtown at the domestic violence courthouse located at 555 West Harrison.
But I should also add that I hope that Julie is chomping at the bit to get back involved in our volunteer project that focuses on helping survivors who are getting a plenary order in the Maywood courthouse. And so for Julie and anyone else interested in that project, we hope to be back up and running soon.
So that is an amazing segue, Melissa, to the question I was about to direct to you, which is, can you talk a little bit more about some of the some of the experiences that pro bono attorneys have had actually representing clients in order of protection cases?
Absolutely. I think that there's a couple of things that I really would like to highlight about the opportunity to represent somebody in a plenary order of protection hearing. So the first is that it's a full hearing experience, right? So for those of you who might be interested in developing those advocacy skills, it involves a direct representation, it involves a opening statement, direct exam, cross-exam, and a closing statement, as well as presentation of evidence. But beyond that, it's about empowering someone. It's about the ability to help somebody take that next step to be protected from their abuser. And so the feedback that we receive from the attorneys who work with us in representing survivors in order of protection cases is universally positive. And it is universally, in many cases, just one of the highlights of their particular experience with pro bono work. So I don't think I am overestimating what it can really do for you as a person, but also the unbelievable impact that you're making on the life of somebody who is surviving domestic violence.
Thank you very much. We also had a question from somebody who's a case manager who's wondering, and I really appreciate this question, of how do you refer somebody that you're working with to our services? So for Legal Aid Chicago services, if you have somebody who's interested in our representation, they can request our services either through Illinois Legal Aid Online, through Legal Aid Chicago's website, or by calling Legal Aid Chicago's number, which is 312-341-1070, to request that they be set up for an appointment. We also have partnerships with many domestic violence service providers. And so I'm hoping that perhaps, Liz, you can give a little bit of an overview on how those partnerships with, for example, the partner agency that you're connected with works in terms of referring clients to us and how that partnership in terms of providing wraparound services works. And then Amanda, if perhaps you could follow up by, if someone needs to access the hotline or services that are offered through the hotline, how they can do that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Benna. So my partner agent, each attorney in our practice group is assigned to a partner agency. My partner agency is Latinas, Mujeres Latinas en Acción, which have a few offices within Cook County. I have collaborated with individuals who are both clients in their Pilsen office and Maywood office. And the way it works is if any of their services, like for example, one of the things that they do is counseling. If one of the counselors feels as though they would be a good client for Legal Aid Chicago, whether it be for legal services related to parentage case, order of protection, divorce, they contact a paralegal specifically in our office who they're assigned to as like their office contact. And then they go through a pre-screening, and we do intakes with them, which usually take about an hour. And then based on capacity, we determine, within a few weeks, maybe a little bit more than that, whether we can accept their case for representation. So I hope that answers your questions.
That's wonderful, thank you. So Amanda, can you talk a little bit about, if someone's working with a survivor or someone is a survivor themselves, how they access the hotline services?
Absolutely. So the hotline number is 1-866-877-6338. I'm going to double check that. It should be on my presentation, but of course now would be the time that I wouldn't be able to remember it off the top of my head. But they're able to call the hotline 24/7, 365 days a year. We always have someone online who can speak in English and Spanish. So bilingual services are available at all times. And we also link to 240 other languages through the language line. We also have texting capabilities. So most of the youth who contact the hotline contact us via text message, since everyone under the age of 24 has abandoned talking on the phone altogether, even in a crisis. So we have a great text messaging program, not just for youth, but for everyone. And we've also added virtual chat through our website so that survivors can virtual chat as well. So for us, accessibility is the key. We want any victim, any survivor, anywhere to be able to contact the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline and receive safety planning, connections to services, transportation resources, and other assistance, including connection to the legal aid services that are available through that combined hotline that Benna referenced earlier. So again, the number for text and chat is, the number for text and chat is 863, sorry, gonna stumble over it again, 877-863-6338. It's available on our website, which is the-network.org. It's 877-863-6338. And again, services are available 24/7 in English and Spanish with connection to 240 other languages. So hit us up.
Thank you, Amanda. So we have a couple more questions that have come in. The first question is, why is the emergency order of protection not available from the court's database as soon as it is issued? That's a fantastic question. And I think in an ideal world, we would love that, right, here in Cook County. The answer to that question is just technology and case management systems, and I'm sure money. The Cook County the clerk of the Circuit Court of Cook County's case management system just does not provide for that type of access in its current form. And, you know, I think that that would be a great thing to have in place, but it just isn't available at this point. So there is no way to access from outside of the clerk's office documents that are in the court record.
I think, Benna, it's important to note that this is state court, and in federal court, you can access those things, but unfortunately, in the Cook County system, we're not able to access underlying documents online, at least at this point. But it is an advocacy ask that many of us have made, particularly since we have been remote during the pandemic, to be able to assist people.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Melissa. And then one last question is, you know, how have we addressed some of the technical challenges, data, device, et cetera, of remote proceedings? I think that is a really good question, which goes to, you know, this issue of the digital divide, I feel like has really come front and center since COVID. Not that it didn't exist pre-COVID, but the fact that, you know, the way that we access court services, healthcare, education, so many things now is tied to our ability to have devices and the data and the Wi-Fi to use those devices is a really, you know, something that COVID has really shown a light on. The answer in this capacity, when it comes to survivors accessing the courts remotely, one thing that the domestic violence community pushed very hard for, and the courts were very receptive to, was the idea that for survivors who do not have access to video or, you know, who can't participate by logging into Zoom like we all are, and who need to call in from a landline or a phone or anywhere, that is available and that they should be able to participate in their court proceedings via phone. And so for now, that is the fallback option that is, you know, maybe not great, but at least make sure that the courthouse doors are open to everybody, regardless of, you know, do they have a smartphone or not.
Thank you so much, Benna. I want to just express my appreciation to the panelists for your just terrific presentations today, and to everyone who's joined us and for staying on with us and giving us an hour of your time today. We really appreciate it. If you haven't already, we invite you to sign up on our website for the remainder of our presentations in this series, and our website is legalaidchicago.org. Our next presentation is on Wednesday, August 26th at noon, and we'll be on home foreclosures. So thank you again to everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your afternoon.